When describing nonverbal communication, one of the elements that is kind of foremost is that when you're even verbally communicating, that there is a nonverbal component that goes along with your verbal communication. So you may be looking at somebody and having a conversation with them and saying specific words, but they're also getting information from your behavior and your body and your eye contact and all those elements that follow along with that. So I think, nonverbal communication is more, I'll say, pervasive, meaning that it's everywhere, that there isn't a place that it isn't going on. So there is that element that is always present, even if you're sleeping. I think just the degree to exhaustion that you might be exhibiting based on your sleep, or if your sleep is restless, sometimes that can be communicating, and there's really no conscious part of you just in general that is thinking about that while you're actually sleeping. Maybe I guess there's maybe situations where that might be going on, but for the most part, I generally don't think about that. So we're going to look at the definition. We're going to look at differences between verbal and nonverbal. We're going to look at the influences of culture, gender, and technology. So the first thing we're going to look at is this idea of intentional versus unintentional. So as I just mentioned, there are times when we're very intentional about how we're communicating with someone non-verbally, and there are times when we're being very unintentional. So somebody's looking at us from across the room, they're not even interacting with us. They may be reading our behavior, or maybe that moment when somebody says something to you that maybe isn't very polite. There might be that initial moment where it registers on your face, and then it just moves past. So we think about, it's almost like the initial response is going to be your unintentional, and then you kind of grab back a hold of your face so you can put back on your little mask and pretend like, whatever they said didn't faze you or whatever. The big piece about it is that it's not spoken. So there are components of verbal communication that kind of fall into nonverbal elements, but for the most part, it's not necessarily something you speak that would fall into the verbal side. And this also relates to both physical and behavioral parts to your communication, so how you're interacting or how you're behaving in that moment. So differences that we're going to look at is this first one, that we're getting information from many locations. We're getting information that's visual, that's auditory, and that's tactile. So we might be able to touch somebody or shake somebody's hand, and you might have a different experience of what that might be to shake somebody's hand, where they have the handbraker, the handbraker shake, that's really firm, or they have the fish handshake, that feels like you're holding a wet fish. Sometimes there's a lot of nervousness, so maybe you might have a sweaty palm, or someone's hands might be cold or warm. We have a lot of things that go on that are going to communicate information to you. And, are we always going to interpret them correctly? No, because nonverbal communication is kind of ambiguous. It's a little harder to read. It's not something that there's necessarily a rule for. We have like some that we can say, oh, when someone crosses their arms, they're being closed off. They might be just cold. So we have those elements, and we've kind of come up with some rules, and it may be that they're being closed off. So, it's not that easy. It's not that easy to say this is what this always means when someone does this, because you can't tell. Sometimes there's sarcasm, and someone might be doing something out of sarcasm. If you don't know that person has that tendency to be sarcastic, you might misinterpret those cues. There are definitely fewer rules that are involved with nonverbal communication. We don't have clear ideas about, again, what something specific means. And there is more meaning. We place more emphasis on nonverbal communication because some of it cannot be manipulated. So you'll see it sometimes when somebody will state something in the affirmative but shake their head no. And that's giving mixed messages. So we'll have a tendency to believe the information that's coming to us through the nonverbal And I don't necessarily think that that's completely conscious that we're doing that. There's a lot of information that we're pulling in based on our unconscious, and we don't necessarily know why we feel a specific way, we just do. And sometimes it's the nonverbal communication that we're reading. We're picking up on small cues that the person is giving us, and we don't register it consciously. So I think those are tricky, and sometimes you almost need to pay attention to some of the little micro facial tics that people might have. I think another place that this kind of thing shows up is if someone's playing poker. And they're going to do all kinds of things to mask that, because there are little tells that people have when they're playing poker. And the same idea happens when you're communicating with somebody. You know, you have little tells, little things that give away how you're feeling at any given moment. So some of those might, you know, people wear sunglasses when they play poker. They'll wear hats. They'll do different things to mask so that it's not as easy for other people to be able to read their expressions. So lots of little things people do to try to overcome what those look like, those little mixed messages. Now, I think this becomes important too, because sometimes when we're looking at cross-culture, there might be meaning in one person's culture that's different from meaning in somebody else's culture. So eye contact is a big one. There are some cultures where, in the American culture, we think you need to make eye contact. And if you're not making eye contact, you're not telling the truth. We even tell children while you're yelling at them, look at me while I'm yelling at you. And the kid's going, So we think that if someone's looking at us, that we have their full attention. So there's that piece that kind of comes along with this idea of eye contact. And there's lots of hand gestures that can be misconstrued. So one of the ones I thought that was interesting, I had one of the people from one of my earlier classes was talking about being a part of the military, and the people in the culture didn't know what flipping somebody off or the middle finger was, but they learned it from the Americans, and they just knew that it was disrespectful or a gesture that you show when you're angry to somebody. And so they would use the gesture not knowing what it meant, but just like out of anger. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, they learned kind of the meaning behind it. I mean, just the anger that shows up behind that specific gesture. So again, you can't necessarily assume that they are going to be exactly the same. Yeah, eye contact is tricky. So like I said, some cultures, American culture, we want you to have direct eye contact. Other cultures, it's actually considered invasive to stare at somebody. It's, you're kind of like you're getting into their space. Insulting or invasion of privacy, they mentioned that, textbook mentions that with Cambodians. And I work a lot with, international students, and, culturally, they don't project their voice very loud, and they're not comfortable with making eye contact. And in order to do well at public speaking generally in America, you have to make direct eye contact with people and speak loud. So it's really a challenge. I mean, where they're having to overcome some of their own experiences by really taking a class like this, because we're kind of teaching them a way, or how to exist well in the American culture. Now there's gender influence as well, and textbook mentions several of these. And I mean, I think it's true when we look at stuff that this is a tendency. I wouldn't say that it's true for everybody. So you might find both genders that do these things well and both genders that aren't good at these things. But the first one that they mention is that women are better at reading cues. They're better at sending and receiving information and reading it accurately. Women have a tendency to have more facial expressions, so that kind of gives information or cues to the person that they're talking to, and they're more likely to look at them. So whether that's eye contact or just actually physically turning their face towards them and looking at them, that has a tendency to fall more with women. So this is what the textbook suggests. Again, I would say you're going to find people on both sides that are both good and bad at both of these. But one that I think is kind of funny and can oftentimes be demonstrated is that a guy will take up more space. He's taught to do that, and this is American. This is American culture. Guys are taught to take up a lot of space. If you look at them when they're lounging, a lot of times they are, have the legs are spread more farther apart. Their arms might be sitting more spread. And then you look at a woman and she's trying to make herself as small as possible. So her legs are crossed, her arms might be crossed. That's not true for every woman, but it has a tendency to be true. And if you wanted to imitate the opposite gender, you could do something like that. You cross things over if you're a guy, emulating a female tendencies, and you can kind of cross those things over. So it can kind of, it's interesting to watch. I mean, as an actor, you learn those things. You learn to pay attention to those nonverbal cues and how a person moves in space and how men might respond differently from a woman, because I think that's always a fun exercise in acting, is to play the opposite gender to reflect a different role. The other thing that is interesting too is this idea of technology. So we have the influence of culture, we have the influence of gender, we have the influence of technology. And what's actually happening in the technology element is that we have more choices now. And in the past, you would either talk to someone over the phone or you might send them a letter. And then we have the advent of email. And email gives you more of an opportunity to interact faster. And then we have texting. So you do some brief messaging back and forth between people, but it doesn't allow for a long-term conversation. And as technology became better, then we end up with things like Skype, and I'm recording this on Zoom. We have more choices about how we're going to interact with people based on the choices of technology. So this has definitely given us more of an opportunity to have face-to-face. We don't get complete. It's not the same as being in the same room with somebody, but the opportunity through people that are in the military and their spouse is in another country, or families that get split apart and live in different parts of the country. This gives you a chance to interact with them at a distance. There you go. This would be just the general definition of nonverbal communication.